God has specifically chosen you to be here at this time and in this place. You have incredible potential, purpose, and calling to push back the darkness and be a light for Christ. Stand for nothing and you'll fall for anything. It's time to stand your ground. This is Unapologetic. Hi everyone, welcome to Unapologetic. I am so excited because today we have Isabel Brown in the studio with us. She is talking about all things dating. We're discussing relationships, what Gen Z Millennials need to know, what maybe they need to let go of, and how they can successfully date and honor God in relationships. Isabel Brown is a best-selling author of Frontlines and a Turning Point contributor. We are so excited to have her with us today. Hey Isabel.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Okay, so I'm excited because we're not just a podcast, we're TV and video podcast too, so everyone can see your pink boots.
My fun pink
What is going
boots.
on?
I am here in Dallas for Turning Point USA's Young Women's Leadership Summit. We host it every single June here in Dallas, Texas, and I've been coming since 2017, so It's very cool to see the growth of the event and the organization as a whole. As you mentioned, I'm a contributor for Turning Point USA, so I do a lot of work in the political media world, but I've really started branching out into the Christian media space as well this last year, and I've had so much fun with my podcast Outdated, which is tackling all of the lies that our culture is feeding millennials and Gen Z on dating, relationships, gender theory, and so much more.
So perfect, which is obviously why we have you on, because you're going to talk about all that. Okay, so real quick, this is not how we were going to start. Why is it important for young women to be involved in politics and in influencing culture?
It has never been more important, I think, for young people, not just young women, to be involved in the process of how our governance works in America. It's not just for super nerdy political science or history people. I am those people, so I totally get it. But it's really dawned on me in this last year in particular, seeing Gen Z come into adulthood, which is soon to be our largest voting bloc, the most powerful generation that's ever existed in American history, the generation with the most access to information ever in American history. Just how broken our system of involvement in America has become. Gen Z is a largely apathetic generation, and it's hard to blame them for that when their entire childhood coming into now a position of adulthood has been marred by tragedy and conflict since 9/11 when we were very young, or even before we were born, all the way through the COVID pandemic, disrupting our high school and college experiences and even young adulthood. And I think there seems to be a fundamental misconception, really, when it comes to who Gen Z is, what our identity looks like, and what our involvement is going to look like in the future. And to make a long story short, I think quite often older generations in America really misunderstand this next generation of adults. We are told to sit down, to be quiet, to wait our turn to get involved with American politics and culture, which is even more important. When in reality, we've always relied on young voices for our country's stability and upholding freedom for every next generation since before our founding. We have this image of the founding fathers in our head as white, old, wrinkly, out of touch men. And I think it's because of the illustrations in our AP US history and government textbooks, when in reality, most of the founding fathers in 1776 were teenagers and punk rock young adults who were rebelling against the old establishment in Great Britain. And I wish we could carry that image forward into the next generation, because I think that's exactly the role Gen Z is about to accomplish as we really experience this turning point, for lack of a better term, in American culture and politics.
Yeah, and the same is true for Christianity. Like, it was mainly teenagers that were the disciples and the ones that were furthering the gospel. So that's such a good point. We're going to talk about that in our second episode.
Yes,
so today we're going to talk about relationships, and you talked about your new podcast. And so whenever I saw it come out, I was like, oh my gosh, I have to talk to Isabel, because relationships are my favorite thing to talk about, because I truly believe next to accepting Christ, nothing really more influences how your life's going to turn out than who you date and who you eventually marry. I met my husband when we were 14, and we dated off and on, but we got married when we were 20, and it was just different seeing the different paths that my friends took and people around me. And then we've been in student ministry for 13 years, and you just see it. You see people totally on track or totally on fire for Christ, and then they start dating the wrong person, or then they start, engaging in sexual immorality, not following God, and either they I think either they feel stuck, like they don't know, well, what am I supposed to do? Or they so have to push down the convictions, push down the truth, because really you can't reconcile sexual immorality. You can't reconcile dating non-Christians, marrying non-Christians with your faith. And so something has to give. So even if you're listening to this and you're not a Christian and you're like, this doesn't apply to me, what's interesting as a therapist that I know is all truth is God's truth.
Amen.
And what's fascinating is even what psychology proves, science proves with relationships in your brain and how you connect and attach, like it all still holds true of Scripture. Like you are going to be happiest. You're going to be most fulfilled when you follow God's plan for relationships. So let's just talk about that. What is Gen Z doing right, and what do you think maybe they're doing wrong? We'll throw millennials into.
Yeah, we love including millennials. It's great. So for clarification, I was born in 1997. I am the first year of Generation Z. I just turned 25 last week.
Do you like ever kind of own millennials, or you're like, no?
You know, a little bit. I do resonate with so many different things because I had so many older cousins and friends that I looked up to, and so I kind of have one foot in each world when I have two younger sisters who are also very Gen Zers. Yes, I am like 25. Right at the cutoff. I just turned 25. And so it's really interesting seeing the impact from millennials and now most of Gen Z just starting to come into adulthood, what that looks like from a relationship perspective. And I'm asked this question quite often, like, what's the big thing we're missing with Gen Z? What are we not understanding about dating and relationships in particular? And the answer is reality and life as we know it is fundamentally upside down from what every single other generation has experienced before us. We are now living in a time where you are evil if you refused to date in the world's standards and want to date in the world of God and in what we know to be true and what's going to lead to a wholesome and fulfilling and happy life. If you walk away from dating apps and the toxicity of hookup culture and you don't want to deal with the LGBTQ community influencing your dating life very intimately, all of a sudden you are publicly enemy number one for your generation. You're labeled on social media as transphobic or homophobic or even racist somehow, that you are outdated, for lack of a better term, and antiquated for modern society, when in reality, the world we are living in and the dating reality that we are living in is so flawed that everybody is miserable dating. And that's the big open secret that I wish everybody talked about more, because we're all experiencing that in real time. And that's exactly why I started my podcast Outdated, is I've made a lot of mistakes along the way. I'm not pretending to be an expert by any means in the dating and relationship world, but I just wished we were having these conversations because everybody is feeling the same way. Pew Research did a really interesting poll with young adults in particular these last few years, which found the vast majority of us are either unhappy in our current dating relationships, so we're not fundamentally satisfied with the person we've chosen as our partner, or we're so unhappy with how we've dated people in the past. Young adults, the vast majority of them, are choosing not to put ourselves on the dating market to begin with. So things have gone so poorly in the decisions we've made already at such a young age that we say, I'm throwing in the towel. I'm never going to give this another shot. I'm just going to spend the rest of my life alone. And I think the reason for that is because when we do enter into those relationships, it doesn't look like a healthy monogamous partnership for life where you are committing your whole self, your mind, body, and soul to another human being in that walk towards Christ. Instead, you have one foot in and one foot out all the time. That could look like polyamory. That could look like hookup culture. That could look like cheating. And that's exactly why we're starting to see the highest divorce rate America has ever seen. More than half of marriages end in divorce. And shockingly, the lowest marriage rate our country has ever seen since 1867 when we started recording marriage rates. That's when we started recording it. So until then,
that was a bad year too.
We never had a lower marriage rate than right now. And that's just so fundamentally sad to me. So I'm looking around at our generation and I'm seeing everybody who's miserable. All of my friends are miserable. I was miserable in so many of my relationships. And until I literally threw in the towel about a year ago and said, that's it, God, I'm done. You can pick the man that comes into my life. Here's generally what I think I would want him to be like. And I'll just wait on that. I had made so many mistakes along the way that I wish I would have just had these conversations to begin with. But as a scientist, you're exactly right. My background is in biomedical sciences.
I knew that. That's why I threw that in there.
I never thought I would be a podcast host or on TV or public speaking for my career. I wanted to be a surgeon. And so I studied all of this in depth in terms of the psychology of dating, or even the brain chemistry and the hormones that are released through sex and intimate relationships. And it really is shocking to see how clearly the evidence lines up for exactly what God has planned for us, leading to happiness and fulfillment, and just overall a well-rounded life. Whereas everything the world is feeding the next generation right now is leading us towards a path of destruction, of loneliness, and heartbreak every single day.
Well, and it goes kind of, you think it goes without saying, but whenever I talk to young people about this, like, not like I'm old, but I have, we got married when we were 20. And so we've been married like 13 years now, and we have triplets. And it was interesting because it's like people try to make it more complicated than it is.
Yeah.
Like, the reason that you want to date is to get married. And having sex really is supposed to be a reason that pushes you towards a motivation to get married. And whenever I was working, I worked in a intensive outpatient hospital for many years, and it was a lot of young people that were really miserable. And we really would have to look at this idea, like, why are people not getting married? But you had to think about the fact that if you're already doing everything that you would do in marriage, like, why would you get married?
Yeah, I mean, it's really communicated
it's
as a piece of paper, or just something kind of pointless, or even something that's ultimately going to set you up for heartbreak, because statistically you're not going to beat the odds. More likely than not, something is going to cause your marriage to fall apart. So why would you put your heart in that situation to be completely devastated later on down the line, when you could just have one foot out the door at all times? And I think it's really all rooted in the fact that God has been so strategically removed from our society in every aspect, not just in dating and relationships, but in this aspect in particular. We don't push our faith towards God. We don't place our faith in the hands of Jesus Christ. Instead, we place our faith in the hands of the people that we're dating. And so we expect this boyfriend or girlfriend or husband or wife or partner to be the end all be all for us, to be the God of our life, and to pick us up when we fall down. And that's fundamentally impossible, because we're human beings. Nobody can ever live up to that standard. And I think that's why we're so let down. We're so discouraged. We're so apathetic towards marriage to begin with, because we know it's not going to fulfill the deepest desires of our hearts. We're trying to put a wedding ring into a God-shaped hole in our heart, thinking that's going to solve all of our problems. And so now marriage has really become obsolete. It's become a, why would I do that if I know I'm just going to get heartbroken in the end?
Yeah, I think that's true too. Whenever I see people talk about relationships, I don't see really hardly any mention of sin and how much that really influences things. And not that I was perfect or my husband was perfect or anything, but whenever you choose to do things God's way, it's just different. I mean, we did get married young. Statistics were against us. Having triplets, statistics were against us. Different stuff in our family. But at the end of the day, like, you make a choice. And I remember when we were 20, we're like, okay, so like forever. And it was interesting because people kind of talked down to us, like, yeah, but like, you don't really know what the world's what's gonna happen in your life, and you don't really know what y'all are gonna go through. And it was just so freeing to decide, right, who cares about what's happened in the past? We don't know what's gonna happen in the future, but we're choosing to do it God's way now. And we're gonna do this. Like, this is our decision. And I don't always share this. I'm going to in this talk because of what we're talking about, and I know that there are other situations, but we just decided, like, we are not getting divorced. And it was interesting, even though of course there are certain allowances in scripture for divorce, but for us to be able to say, like, we're not doing this, that even put like a different guardrail around the marriage, because it was like, wow, well, I mean, a lot of times we talk about immorality before getting married, but it's not like suddenly you get married and you're like, oh, now I have no problems.
Yeah.
And like, it was just really interesting to go ahead and walk that path of purity, dating and in marriage, because it helps set you up for success once you're in marriage. I think a lot of people think, like, you're struggling with purity, you're struggling in this area, and then you get married and able to have sex, and so any temptation goes away. But the truth is, like, you're training ahead of time for staying pure inside of marriage.
I love that. I never thought about it like that way as a training exercise, but I think I can really relate to that. I totally understand that. And I wish we framed that better for the next generation. I love that you bring up sin as really a heart problem that's leading to so many of these problems manifesting in relationships and dating culture at the macro 30,000 foot level, because it really does start within. It starts with the desires of your heart. It starts with you dedicating yourself to the way of God instead of the way of the world. And I think the church community in America really has done a disservice to Generation Z because we've shied away from talking about very controversial subjects that ultimately are some of the most important conversations we could be having, sex and purity culture being one of those conversations. We don't even like to use that word sex, and I'm sure if you're listening to this podcast, you may be cringing a bit.
Purity. I was like, wait, I shouldn't say that because we're all against purity culture now.
But in reality, if we don't talk about these things, the only place the next generation is going to be exposed to them is through the ways of the world. It's through watching hit TV shows like Euphoria, which is legitimate pornography on television. It's through following their favorite singers and celebrities and actresses on social media who are rooted in the way of the world, or maybe their favorite influencers who are talking about how great their life is now that they've changed their gender or decided to date 8 people at the same time, and why that's a good thing.
It's like my nightmare.
It is a nightmare. And I started Outdated largely in response to a podcast called Call Her Daddy. And I don't know if you're familiar with this podcast at all.
That is not my favorite show.
If you're listening, you may not be familiar at all, but it's the number 2 podcast in the world behind the Joe Rogan Experience. It's hosted by a young woman named Alex Cooper, and ultimately was created to talk about dating from a female perspective with no filter, which you think that's a great idea, right? That's a fantastic opportunity for us to have real conversations. Millions upon millions of people listen to every single episode of this podcast, and it is raunchy and horrible and encourages cheating on your boyfriend and sleeping around and having literally zero morality whatsoever, because that's all of a sudden freeing for young women in particular. You get to embrace your feminine energy and embrace, walking in total sexual immorality so that you can be free from the bondage of culture, when in reality, I think that's walking into the bondage of culture. You're walking away from actual freedom. But that is the cultural norm now. And I think that's a great illustration of what happens when people who are rooted in truth, which we know to be the truth, the way, the life, refuse to talk about controversial conversations. All of a sudden, almost all of my Christian friends I know are listening to this podcast.
Really?
And that becomes normal for them. And so I'm glad that we get to sit down and have this conversation today, because more church leaders and individuals with a platform within the community of the church in America need to be willing to talk about sin, and they need to be willing to talk about the temptations from the devil that ultimately lead your heart away from the truth of God.
Purity culture being under attack right now. That's exactly when I grew up. So I was a teenager in the early 2000s. So that was like exactly how I grew up. And in fairness, I just want to say, like, it depends what you're talking about. But for me, like, there was a big emphasis on dating and on waiting for your spouse, and it worked out for me. Like, that was a good, so whenever I got off track or I was dating the wrong person, like, I had such a good foundation because that is what we were talking about. Now, there was basically no direction for if you messed up or if you wanted to come back to church. I mean, it really was seen as like the worst thing you can do is have sex outside of marriage. And so it didn't leave a lot of room for, well, what about people that like want to come back or they messed up and they want forgiveness, they want to start over. Then you fast forward like several years later, and I'm the girls minister at our church, and I just come from being a therapist full time, and I was working under my husband, and I had to come up with our first girls event. And I was like, I don't know what to do. Like, I did not go to seminary. I went to counseling because I just love like people really saying like, I am struggling with this. How do I get help? Like, and so much of it, you'll think this is interesting. I did not set out to help people like with sexual anything. I was really not interested in that. Like, I was like, that is really not what I want to do. And it was fascinating how many people like their presenting issue was depression or anxiety or panic attacks. And almost, I mean, it was just unbelievable how much of it went back to sexual addiction, sexual abuse, like something sexual. So that really is something that Satan uses. Like God makes it beautiful. This is something that's supposed to connect us. It's supposed to be an expression of love inside a marriage. And I mean, how much Satan uses it to trap people is
Amen.
really amazing. But I didn't know what girls' event to do. And Ryan said, well, what do you like? I said, I like talking about dating and I like eating candy. And so we called it sugar.
I love
and
that.
it was the unofficial was talk about your current and future sugars. And it was like what you're saying, like they could ask anything. I'd have them write in anonymously. But that's what people are interested in. And I think that maybe we try to over spiritualize it a little bit. Like, oh, you're worldly if you want to talk about dating or if you want to talk about sex. But it keeps people so stuck and so trapped and so out of line of God's will and what he has for them. And so what do you say to someone listening who's like, okay, I've already messed up. I already haven't done things God's way, which I can't even believe we're having to talk about this.
I know.
Now we're having to even define what God's way is. I just talked to someone about this. I was like, well, 1 Corinthians 6:18 says, flee sexual immorality. All other sin is outside the body, but sexual sin's against yourself. And people are even arguing what sexual immorality is. So let's talk about two things.
Yeah.
What do you say to someone who's listening to this, feeling shame, and they're like, I haven't done things the right way? What advice would you give?
It's never too late to turn around and walk in the other direction. I grew up in the Catholic Church, and the word repent is a very extreme word in how I grew up. And I think it carries such a negative connotation. But I remember when I was attending Catholic high school at one of our retreats, one of the priests phrased it really well. He said the actual definition of repentance is to literally stand where you're standing, turn around, and walk in the other direction. That's all that means. It doesn't mean anything else. And I loved that very simple definition because it provides such a clear pathway forward for what happens when you are feeling in that stuck position of I can never move on. I can never go forward. The good news is you don't have to go forward. You can turn around and walk in the other direction of going forward. And I loved that image so much, especially with sexual immorality and sins in dating and relationship culture. You are not alone in experiencing that. That is absolutely the norm right now, including within the church, by the way. And I wish we had more of an open culture in having those discussions and encouraging young women in particular who often feel so silenced by the situation that they're in. They're embarrassed, they're shameful. They don't want to come forward about maybe abuse that they're experiencing or bad decisions that they've experienced, when in reality, you are never too far gone for God. God will always meet you where you are at and help hold your hand to get you to where you need to be. And so don't be ashamed. Don't be afraid to talk to somebody that you trust, to vocalize what you're feeling and what you're experiencing, because then once you bring that darkness into the light, you can be set free from it. And just remember that you're not alone. There's a huge community of other young people, the vast majority of whom are going through almost exactly the same thing you are right now.
Right. I think of the verse, I use it a lot with girls. I will restore the years the locusts have eaten. And I mean, the great thing is God is outside of time and space. Like it sounds like, ooh, like something like very
Stranger Things or something.
How interesting. I mean, I'm like this huge TV fan. Like, and I mean, I don't watch Euphoria. I don't know about that. But I mean, I love TV and movies. And it's always interesting to me how much we're drawn to like superheroes and everything and like this other world, Stranger Things, Star Wars, whatever. And I'm like, there really is another world.
Yeah.
And like as Christians with the Holy Spirit, like you really have access to it. And so it's always fascinating to me how much we're just naturally drawn to that.
I never thought about it that way.
It's there. Like there is another world. Like right now, Isabel and me talking, there's other stuff going on. And it's just fascinating. This is like totally a plug for this book, but it's This Present Darkness by Frank Peretti. And it's kind of like the modern Screw Tape Letters from C.S. Lewis. And it looks at this town and like what's going on in relationships and dating and marriage in the church, and then it will span out and show like the angels and the demons and like the spiritual. It sounds kind of like what, but if you like Stranger Things and you like superheroes, like the truth is we do live in different dimensions.
Yes.
Like there are other things going on. You choosing to stay in a relationship with someone that doesn't know Christ, like that's not just your decision, that's a spiritual decision. That's a spiritual warfare for your future. And we talk about this a lot on this show because I want girls to get a picture of 10 years down the road. I never have to worry what Ryan's telling the triplets. They are at the age of asking, how do I go to heaven? What about Jesus? I just never even have to worry. Like, I
love
know
that.
exactly what he's going to say. I never have to wonder what the conversations are going to be. I never have to wonder, do I have to take them to church by myself? And just really I think girls are good at thinking about their future. I've talked to guys about this. They're like, I would never, that does not resonate with me. But girls really, we already make up our future. We already think about it. I mean, think about what it's going to be like around the dinner table, what it's going to be like when your little girl asks her dad about dating and about who to marry. I mean, these are real things that really happen.
They're the big things
Yeah.
too. They're not just real things. That is everything at the end of
Right.
the day. And I used to be the type of dater that I kind of thought I could fix people's
Yeah.
relationships with God, that maybe they were raised Christian and they always had a great foundation of faith, but they weren't building upon that themselves as actual adults, as young men in college or young professionals. And I always thought, okay, well, maybe if I pray really hard, or if I bring them to church, or if I get them a book to read,
Yeah.
or maybe if we try to watch church together on the weekends, if he doesn't
Yeah.
want to go, maybe all of a sudden he'll have this huge change of heart. And that does happen sometimes, but it's not you that's fixing the person. And I think young Christian women really need to be aware that when you have that deep down feeling that something just isn't quite lining up right, that's not you overthinking it. That's not you being crazy, because that is what the world tells you you're doing, that you're totally messing it up and you're messing up your
Right.
relationship because you're so neurotic and you're clingy and you're overthinking and you don't want to, stress him out too much. Don't freak him out. He's going to run away. Well, that might be okay if it's not the right relationship for you. And when you have that feeling, listen to that, because that is the Holy Spirit speaking to you, that probably isn't the right relationship to be in. Ultimately, only God can bring people back to God. That change of heart and that conversion can't happen from all of the effort of you trying to do everything in your power to turn him back into a Christian man. And who you really end up with, who you date, who you marry, who's going to be the father of your children, really does come down to the most important thing, being a leader in faith and leading your relationship, ultimately your marriage and your children, back towards the truth of the universe and the love of Jesus Christ. And do not take that responsibility lightly, because that is what we've done for the last several years in America, and look where it's brought us.
So what if we just want to have fun, Isabel? Like, what if he's just cute and we're tired of being alone and we just want to hang out?
Just hanging out. I hate this term so much, Julia.
I'm so glad.
Because this
I'm so glad I
is
got to say it.
reality for Gen Z. You never want to put a label on anything.
Yeah.
You're not official, but you're a thing. That's what we say.
Yeah.
When you're not actually boyfriend and girlfriend. And girls, every single one of them that I know, agonize over these young men that refuse to actually commit to a relationship. Maybe they met them through a dating app, or they've been casual friends for a long time, and occasionally they'll kiss or something, but they won't actually be boyfriend and girlfriend.
That sounds terrible.
It's
I
horrible.
basically the first month would be like, are we getting married?
Exactly. That's exactly where my brain goes, because that's my priority list. But we've convinced successfully an entire generation of young women, too, arguably with millennials and Generation Z, that that's normal. And that if you legitimately ask, are you in this? Are you trying to have a relationship? What is your goal in life? Are you walking towards marriage? Do you feel called towards that? You will be looked at as crazy, like you have three heads and you're going to scare him off. You're going to scare the boy away. We deserve so much better than that, is my very simple response to that. You deserve a man who not only is going to commit himself to you, but commit himself to you fully, never cross any boundaries, respect you as a child of God, and love you as wholeheartedly as he possibly can, as close to unconditional love as we can get as human beings. And anything less than that is not God's plan or God's design for you. So stop trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. If a guy is interested in you, he will absolutely take the time to let you know and make sure you are aware of that, and continue proving that to you every single day.
And this is just a freebie. The quickest way to get someone to commit is not to cross any lines.
Yes, 100%.
Because then you're more interesting than they're pursuing you. And I think, whenever we're talking about topics, I know you do lots of media and write, and I do lots of things that are similar. We are talking generally, like most Gen Z, most millennials. But I truly believe there's always a remnant. Like, I meet people all the time that don't think anything like these stereotypes that we see. And I think realizing it doesn't take 10 guys that are eligible. It's one.
Yep.
And I love this. I would love to say I came up with it, but I didn't. Mark Batterson talks about this in one of his books, but that God knows everyone. So whenever we think, well, it's all up to us. Like, we have to pick the right app, or we have to pick the right young singles group, or we have to be at the right place at the right time. Like, ultimately, God knows everyone, and he's going to connect you to the person. So with that in mind, what role do women play in their relationships, in pursuit? You want to give an opinion on dating apps?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
I have a lot of opinions on
Okay.
dating apps. You mentioned remnants from times long ago that are
Yeah.
not really relevant to today's society. I feel like one of those all the time. That's why I titled my podcast Outdated, because even shockingly at now 25 years old, I feel outdated by modern society, that somehow I don't really fit into what has become normal. And I think everyone secretly feels that way. I don't think anyone is really genuinely happy or fulfilled in the way we've chosen to direct our culture in the 2020s, but we're all sort of pretending to, because no one wants to be the odd one out and to raise your hand above the crowd and say, hang on a second, I don't know if this is really good for our generation. So that's why I started my podcast. I've never downloaded a dating app ever, which is very controversial to say, shockingly, in 2022. I don't know which way you swipe. I think I could probably guess it's a 50-50 guess. But I do know most of my friends who have, and I very, very, very rarely have ever seen successful relationships come out of a dating app. 2 or 3, maybe, off the top of my head. And that was after many, many, many failed experiences through these apps. Ultimately, they're not encouraging reality. And I did a whole episode on my podcast of these apps about how dangerous they are, because they do put young women in positions of abuse and hurt all of the time, about how fake they are and how many things are edited and perfectly curated to feed you an image of who somebody is versus what they actually turn out to be in reality, and just how unsuccessful they are in actually creating relationships, what the data on that looks like. So you guys can go check out that episode if you want more specifics, and we can spend an hour talking about that. But really, at the root, it's just not reality. It's not based in who somebody really is. Everybody has edited photos. You have a perfectly curated bio, just like on social media, of what you want someone's first impression of you to be versus who they actually meet in real life. And it encourages not dating someone, because ultimately you are a customer of that app. Whether or not you're paying for the app, which many of them are paid services, there's advertisement revenue and other things that these companies are making money off of you for being on the app. So they have an incentive to not help you ultimately find love and get off these apps. They want you to be a repeat customer. And internal documents from a lot of these apps say that phrase, repeat customer, over and over and over again, because they can't continue making money off of you if you actually settle down into a relationship. It's weird to think about it that way, but it is. It's a business. It's a company. And ultimately, you can't turn love into a business. Love has to be what you mentioned, God orchestrating things outside of time and space and outside of the reality that we know and experience here in America today.
All right, we're closing. What is your best dating advice?
Wait on God and trust in God with everything you have. I spent so long in my teenage years and young adult years being obsessed with love and wanting to get married and give my whole heart to somebody. And I did over and over and over again, only to realize that I was always giving a lot more into a relationship than I was getting back. And I spent so many nights crying and sad and upset, wondering why that was happening, that maybe that was just normal in dating, and was so desensitized to what I actually could experience if I just put it all on the table and said, God, you can do it in your time and on your terms, and I will just wait until that all happens. I was really lucky. I hit that wall about a year ago, and 3 weeks later, I met my current boyfriend, who's absolutely the most wonderful, godly, perfect man, and I am so, so grateful that God brought him into my life without any prior warning, and did not make sense, as you mentioned, how God orchestrates things, and we never should have met in the first place, but we did. And I just look back on all of those nights of heartbreak and wondering and questioning, is this really all there is? Is this really the best that's out there? No, it's not, and I wish I could tell my younger self that. I wish I learned that lesson a lot sooner. So if you're listening to this and you are in the dating pool, if you're experiencing this right now, there is no better substitute than the man God is going to bring into your life. And sometimes that's going to take 3 weeks. Sometimes that's going to take a really long time. But just have patience, continue to be the best version of yourself. And ultimately, when you're really rooted in the truth and the love of God, you'll be able to give that to another human being as well. And that's very special.
And to work outdated in, I think what's helped me the most is realizing scripture is applicable, it's real, it's live, it's not outdated, and the Bible has a lot to say about relationships and how to successfully date and be in a relationship and get married and stay married. And so just realizing it really is the most important relationship of your life outside of your relationship with Christ. And the Bible has a lot to say about it. I am so excited about your I don't know if you call it a ministry. I think of it as a ministry because truthfully, like lives can be ruined or can really be made, like entire legacies of Christian families because of who you choose to date. So I see it as a ministry, but how can we stay connected to Outdated, to your show? I know because of off-air exciting things you have coming up. So how can we stay connected to Isabel?
Yeah, so you can listen to Outdated across podcast platforms and on my YouTube channel if you'd rather watch it. We have some fun cowboy boot days on there as well, so you can always watch visually. There is a lot of expansion and very fun news with Outdated that I can share in the next couple of weeks, but not quite yet. So I can't wait for you guys to see all of that. But you can learn that news and follow all of my other content that I work on social media at the Isabel Brown, all across social media platforms.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being on.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for tuning in today to Unapologetic. Remember that you can hear today's episode and more at ptv.org/Julia and wherever you get your podcasts.